we need to start making more conscious material choices.
I set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.
Welcome to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's DIF, an online event series that aims at shifting mindset and inspire actions towards a circular economy. My name is Elodie, and I will be asking the questions on this panel that we called A New Story About the Future of Fashion. Don't forget that this is an interactive session, so feel free to send us your questions, doubts, or comments using the ThinkDiff hashtag or leaving a comment on the page you're watching this on. So how could a new narrative for the fashion industry help shifting the customer's desires from wanting more to wanting better? And how could the creatives in the fashion industry rewrite this narrative, integrating circular principles? To answer those questions, we have in the studio today two guests, Josie Warden, senior researcher at the RSA. Josie is an embroidery designer and is also working as part of the Make Fashion Circular partnership between the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the RSA. And we also have Natasha Ratcliffe-Thomas, reader in marketing and fashion business at the British School of Fashion. So I would like to start with you, Josie. Why do you think a new narrative for the fashion industry is needed to shift towards a circular economy?
So I suppose when we're talking about narratives, we're really talking about stories. And we use stories to explain the world or to find patterns, to help us to express our values and understand how we live. And I think if you think about fashion, fashion has so many stories inside it. It's about, we tell stories, fashion tells us stories about how we identify ourselves, how we interact with one another. But we've also got stories in fashion around how we relate to the material world and to the environment. So we've got really used in the last decade, 15, 20 years or so, of having a story that we can and we should buy things regularly, so we can consume clothing, we can buy things very frequently and often, and that's quite a new kind of narrative. So I think the important things about narratives and stories is that they can change as well. And some of the stories we've got around fashion maybe are not serving us properly. And I think as society, as we develop and come to learn new things, our stories evolve. And I think we're at a point now where we really need to think about how we can evolve those stories for fashion, because the ones we currently have around how we consume things are not serving us. They're creating huge amounts of waste and pollution. So we need to think about what those new narratives could be, and fashion's a really exciting place to kind of explore those, because so much of it is about telling stories with the way you wear clothes.
Yeah. Natasha, what is your point of view on this?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the panel. And just picking up on what Josie said, there have been a lot of stories around fashion. And unfortunately, in the last year, 18 months, maybe 2 years, there have been a lot of negative stories. And so I think quite rightly, consumers and people working in the fashion industry are asking questions for which they need answers. And if we're thinking about transitioning away from this kind of model of make and use and throw away, then we need to think about how we communicate that. And actually, the fashion industry has something that's expanded massively. It has a massive global reach. It has massive potential for good, but at the moment, there's a lot of negative stories around that. And I think there've been questions asked of specifically strong fashion brands about what are you doing about this situation? People don't want to feel bad about their fashion choices. So I think that's the reason.
We have another guest joining us online, Shona Marshall, curator and writer based in New York. Hi, Shona. How are you doing?
Great, thanks.
I would like to ask you the very same question. Why do you think a shift in the narrative of the fashion industry is needed to move towards a circular economy?
Well, I think it's actually an ideological question. I've been doing research over the last year around this subject, this topic. And when the mainstream media outlets changed their language around how they speak about the climate crisis to crisis, instead of climate change, which they felt was passive, they thought they had to change the language and wording that they used. I started to think about how we could change the semiotics of fashion, the kind of visual and written language around how we talk about the way we clothe our bodies and relate to fashion. So it's something I'm really interested in, and I genuinely believe fashion's fashionable. So in the way that you can make Crocs fashionable, you can make these thoughts and feelings and approaches to why we buy things and how we buy things fashionable. So that's something I'm really intrigued by. I think it's a really important time to start reframing our actions. I think an interesting thing that came up for me was thinking around slow fashion, how we talk about the materials and the way in which the garments produced and made. I've been really thinking about slow style. So how do we really look at the way we clothe our body in something that can't be purchased immediately? It's like learning a language. It takes time, takes thought, consideration, and you have to practice and you have to keep going back in. And it's really fun and joyful fashion. And those things, when they relate to identity and representation, are all the brilliant things that we love about it. And I think it's really important to say within this conversation that it's not about wearing the same clothes every day and not experimenting, exploring, because it's something I spoke to Josie about when we first met, is that's all the things that we love about fashion, is that kind of playfulness and fun and expression of identity.
In this sense, how could we still, by the narrative, give this sense of self-expression through clothes, but shifting the narrative from acquiring on the latest trends? What do you think? What are the words? What are the stories that we could tell about that? Maybe Josie, if you want to start.
I think what Shona was saying around the difference between like even the fashion and style language is really interesting, or the fact that we call all clothing fashion. There's kind of little things in there that we get so used to saying that you kind of don't ever question them, but actually there is a difference between thinking about just trends which come through and by definition have to be replaced very rapidly, versus I really like the idea that Shona was saying around sort of learning style, or learning how to dress and what suits you and what you're interested in and what feels good to you, and that being something you have to kind of explore yourself. I think that's very different to the message of if you simply by buying this garment you will suddenly become a different person or express yourself differently, or it's a more of a relationship, I think, rather than just a transaction, which I think is a really interesting way of exploring it.
And I would say from my research that lots of brands that have been successful in this space are brands that are founded on principles that are more than appearance, identity and product. And what I would say is in the past, a lot of the stories were very product focused, and then we moved into an era of brand. And I think we've kind of gone beyond that now. And I think people want to buy into things that have personal meaning for them. And so where we see brands, like Patagonia or someone standing for something politically maybe, and having more meaning, and I think people want to buy into that kind of movement. Again, if we think about the Tom's footwear story, they even called themselves a movement and people wanted to join in with that. So people want to feel good about purchases if they are making purchases. So I think some of that language has really changed already.
Mm-hmm.
I was on the subway the other day and I've forgotten the brand, but they advertised to me already on Instagram. I forgot what it's called. And they're really big selling points. We can get you stuff real quick, like one day. And on the subway, the poster says, get what you crave. And I just thought, it's such potent language, this kind of idea that you're craving it, you need it, you want it. It's like it's kind of the language of addiction. And I kind of think a lot about, I've been doing a lot of research, and I love Margaret Macmillan, the Canadian historian, and she says that history acts as like a road sign that says dangerous curve ahead, like beware, we've been here before. She's obviously talking about wars and politics, and but I've been doing a lot of research into late 80s, early 1990s, which was a really interesting time in fashion photography. I mean, it completely revolutionized the way in which you look at identity in terms of fashion. Photographers like Nigel Shafran, Jürgen Teller, David Sims, Corinne Day, stylist Melanie Ward, Anna Cockburn. they really were looking at individual expression. And people like Melanie Ward, she was styling mostly with things that she found at charity shops and vintage shops. And I think it's really interesting to look back at that time and look at the foundations of style in that moment and how that could be relevant to us, not in a nostalgic way, but more in an expressive way. And how do you start to reframe those things to make them really exciting? I mean, one thing that really intrigues me, and I'd love to ask you more about it, Natasha, is say you're selling something, you could sell anything. That's the language and you know, the power of marketing, basically. It's like, oh, you need this, it's carrot dangling. You need to get this garment, you need to get this jumper, this dress, and you will be whole if you buy it. What if you started to use that device for engaging in the wider planet, or sense of style or expression or individual like identity, and that's something I've been really thinking about. How could you use those kind of tools of sales for something different? It's kind of a conceptual idea.
Great question. Well, I think one of the things I'd like to sort of lay out is that marketing and sales are actually two different business functions. And so marketing really genuinely should be about responding to needs and wants, and it shouldn't be about pushing sales. And so I know you're going to be having panel discussions about business models, so I'm not going to drift too far into that. But I think if you look at one of the real classic cases of a fashion or apparel marketing case study that had a big impact was when Patagonia did their Don't Buy This Jacket campaign, which was literally around the kind of Black Friday sales in the States, which generate loads and loads of, possibly needless consumption. We've just had Singles Day in China with record-breaking sales and massive consumption there. And Patagonia were just saying, actually, don't buy this jacket. Maybe you don't need it. And that was such a big shock. And it's a really interesting case, I work in education, to discuss with young people about, is that a cynical marketing ploy? Is it a genuine plea? And I think that's where we'll see people coming through successfully, where their actions match the language. So I think at the moment we have a danger of people picking the language of circularity. And I was at London Fashion Week seeing lots and lots of brands claiming circular credentials. But actually it's where they follow through with that and where you have some kind of credence that it's going to stick. But absolutely, there are focus groups, there are data mining to work out the best terms and the keywords to use in this sort of area. But I think, again, if we're thinking about it from marketing terms, we need to think that people are different and we want different things. So some people are going to respond to the circular model because of their kind of ethical, environmental concerns. Other people are going to be excited about the innovation side of, the new technologies and recycling and etc. And I would say, in my own research that we've been working with Textile, an organisation in London, we've been looking at people who are kind of ahead of the curve in fashion at Fashion Week, and people who are super interested in recycling. So that's a word, that's a key point and a concept that I think consumers are increasingly interested in. And they're also interested in wearing vintage and talking about that. And for me personally, that's super interesting because I've always worn what in my day was secondhand. And then it translated into vintage. And again, that's a vocabulary change to suddenly make something, it's a bit more stylish. So actually we do have power through words, back to Shona's point about the semiotics.
We got a question online from Scarlett. Actually, I think it links quite nicely into what you were just saying. That is, how important are stories versus reality? And most people say that they would happily pay for more sustainable clothing, but behaviors may be different. So
I think there's a thing around stories being also not just the story to tell ourselves internally, but that kind of vision of where you want to get to. And I think we're in a really interesting time where we know the current models we've got aren't working. And that's not just in the fashion system, it's across all systems, across the whole economic system. Lots of things are really shifting, politics is really shifting. And for us to kind of imagine where we could get to and a new kind of future, having those stories around, actually could we imagine how things could be circulated in a different way is really important because it helps us to conceptualise where we could get to and try and imagine that, and that helps you to move in that direction. So I think that is a really powerful part, I think, that the circular economy can play, is like helping you get to that, conceptually get to that point. But there is obviously this, when it comes to data, our kind of aspirations and our actions, there is I'm sure there's lots of research that talks about that kind of value action gap, where you think you want to do something but you can't do it. And that sort of shows the importance of the structures that get built around the stories we tell ourselves. We've told ourselves the story that we can just take stuff, make things, chuck it away. So our whole economic system has been built around that, and it makes it very hard for individuals to take those different steps. So it's interesting when you say there's kind of new innovations or there's new businesses coming through or ideas, or even a story like "Don't buy this jacket" helps you to try and step a little bit out of your regular day-to-day life and think about, could you take a different action? But it's definitely not an easy thing for individuals to do.
Yeah, when we feel about this kind of a balance between education and creating the desire, so how could the stories actually teach something at the same time that they generate the desire for it?
But I think one of the things is to remember that as humans, although as much as we want to think we're rational creatures, we're really driven by emotion and our old brain and that kind of thing. So I think it's important to think about, the attitude behaviour gap is, you might conceptually feel you want to do something, but actually things are still going to appeal to you in the same way. And a lot of people, it's to do with price, and I think we have to think about accessibility and a lot of people's choices. And also, if we take this more globally, in lots of parts of the world, for example, even now, it wouldn't be great to be wearing second-hand clothes. That would be a kind of a stigma, something you're trying to get away from. And I think, so there's a lot of different triggers at lots of different levels, and lots of people are going to go down to price and material. But I think what we're seeing coming through in the research globally is that consumers are really confused. So they want to do the right thing, but they don't know what the right thing is, and they have a lot of different information. So I think where collections are curated, there's some great apps out there, like the Good On You app, or the sort of online platforms where they're curating ethical, sustainable, circular brands. That's the sort of thing that's going to appeal to consumers, because they're not going to have to do so much legwork. There are going to be people who are really interested in digging and finding that out, and there are other people who just want to say, do you know, I just want to buy something that I can feel okay about and that I don't have to do all the hard work. And that's, I think, again, where brands and businesses have a responsibility to be transparent about what they're doing, and to be transparent about their intentions and what you're buying into when you're buying, and what the true costs of those decisions are.
Mm-hmm. Shona?
There were two things I was thinking there. I think it's maybe important to say, and it's something Josie and I have spoken about before, is that there's a lot of emphasis on individual action, and it comes from both sides. It is as much individuals leading the charge in their own small lives that have a big impact on themselves, but then also big business. And I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting thing for me, and something that keeps coming up in my ideas is that the fashion industry itself, the people who shift what is fashionable, it's really, really very few people. It's probably about 200 people that have that influence to make change in what's fashionable. And so I think it's really interesting how you kind of tap into those different communities. And then you've got big business. And I know, I can't remember why you told me that maybe this was not relevant to this conversation, but I'll bring it up, and you can dismiss it completely. But it's measure on growth. So a lot of the reports that you read that we need to shift our measure from growth on GDP to measuring growth on other factors. Happiness is one that I know the OECD have done research around, and so those kind of things in linking them back to big business, there is this. I really can't remember what you told me, but this was not that relevant for the conversation. But big business, they will lose money if they move to more sustainable practices. So it's really tough for them to turn the ship around. So I'm really intrigued by how you start to tell different stories, so that all these factors, they almost all need to come together. It can't be just, me in my apartment in New York not buying any clothes. I haven't bought anything new for a year, and that was was an experiment I was working on as a personal project. But what impact does that have, and how can you start to make bigger impacts with the stories that you tell? And that's something I'm really interested in.
Yeah, Well, I think, to be honest, for big business, and fashion is a business, and it's strongly related, obviously, with the textile industry. I think the case for more sustainable and more circular practice has been well made, and I don't think there are many people who aren't actually talking about that, along with things like sustainable development goals and etc. But I think for big industries, they have advantages, in big research and development. They can do innovation. They have economies of scale. But as you said, they're quite, a massive structure may be more difficult to switch around. But I think that also, interesting for our conversation, means that internal conversations and the internal communication needs to be really just as important. And I think if we look at what someone, a pioneer like Stella McCartney, has done in this area of bringing the whole notion of sustainability, alternative materials, fashion technology, political stance, even your communication, having a campaign with models on a landfill site for a luxury brand. I mean, it really has changed a lot of the conversations. And also, as much as we might account for different things in GDP, it's accounting for the costs, isn't it? And that's the thing, that people are doing now, is they're actually accounting more for the externalities and the ripple effect. So then you'll find that things balance more.
Yeah, I think there's that sense that stories that we talk about in fashion also tie into bigger stories that we talk about in society and the economy more generally, like how we talk about progress and how we measure that in our society and how we measure development, etc. So, but I think the interesting thing about fashion is that it has that explicit purpose to kind of tell stories and shape ideas, and that's what makes it, I think, particularly exciting to be able to explore some of these things, whereas doing that through possibly some other sectors would be almost less of a communications tool. I think fashion has that huge ability to not just impact itself, but also to impact other parts of the way we live through the way these kinds of organisations operate, through the way new brands develop and how they connect with their consumers. But I think it's also thinking about fashion or clothing not just as a business interaction between a citizen and a corporation, but between citizens as well. Like, how do you share things with one another, and getting more used to that kind of maybe informal part of the economy is also really interesting with fashion, because it has so many emotions connected to it with people and relationships.
And I think that reuse and repair story, which is really strong, is also a nice way for people to feel more connected with their clothes. That's something that's been really pleasing to me, seeing that more and more people are actually interested in how things are made, but also how they could repair their own clothes. And I really love the kind of visible mending movement, and that, and just bringing, and that again is a way for brands to tell different stories about their clothing, not only how it's made, but how it can be maintained. And when I was in New York last week, I dropped into both Patagonia and Nudie Jeans, and they have the kind of repair shops in the store, and it becomes part of that story. And another part of the fashion industry we've been talking about is the retail experience. How do we, have the physical, how does that survive? And actually having those places where people come together, can repair their clothing or see it being repaired in store, again, I think is quite a human story where people can really connect with their clothes. But obviously in lots of parts of the world, that's a normal thing. That's like, yeah, we do this. We're always having things mended. So I think we have to be really careful as well that our conversation doesn't just become this very narrow, international city conversation, and just think actually this is what regular people do with their clothing.
So we are talking a lot about, sorry, Shona, I would like to ask a question, because I think we are focusing on the brands a lot, but what is, and actually it's a question for you, Shona, what is the role that you see the journalists, fashion journalists, have to take also in this sense?
Well, I think that's a really exciting one, because I think with writing, you're delivering your point of view. I was thinking a lot when everyone was speaking just then about how fashion's, you got to make it sexy. You got to make it really sexy and attractive, and you want to buy into it. And I think that's a really interesting thing for me in fashion's quite dramatic. It's kind of one thing that I don't want to skirt around, like this is a trend, like this is trendy right now to talk about the environment. So how do you make it real? And that's something I'm really interested in. One thing I was really intrigued by is this idea of plastic straws. So the fashion industry, for example, they got obsessed with plastic straws. No more plastic straws, no more, no way. So they use paper straws, but are the trees okay then? So it's okay, we're fine for the trees, so we just make some paper straws. And it's like, you haven't really understood a concept underpinning why we don't use the plastic straws. It's not only about the sea turtles, it's about waste. And I say this to my students, what about nature's straw, your mouth? And, you know, these kind of things are really interesting to start really having wider conversations around how people like journalists, like, you know, I write a lot now for publications, which isn't something I used to do. It's something I've done in the last sort of year, really, because it's an interesting time to be alive. And fashion is a mirror to our time. So if you want to talk about identity politics or globalization or the environment, fashion is an awesome way in to do that. And so, for example, I wrote the other day a piece about my own personal style history in a really personal way, relating it to 1990s fashion photography. And I started to ask, like, you know, can we build style? Can we nurture style? Can we learn it? Can we build upon it? And I think these are the really interesting things. Like the New Yorkers wrote, different journalists have written 2 pieces recently in the New Yorker talking about secondhand clothing. So they were talking about the real, and then sustainability. They were talking about reformation. And in both the articles, they make the point that you've saved a certain amount of water and your carbon footprint by buying these things that are, you know, reformation, I guess it uses fabrics that are waste, I think. And then the real is secondhand. And I think it's really interesting. They make the point in a kind of passing way, what if you didn't buy the skirt at all? Or what if you didn't buy the dress at all? And I think that's really interesting, journalists and writers starting to open up those kind of thought processes, to kind of connect the dots, to kind of dig deeper. But we have a real responsibility there. And I think when you're talking about trends, it's not going to work out, because you're really selling something that is the new look, you know? And maybe that works if you're buying luxury and you're saving up and you're buying 1 or 2 things per season. But if you're buying at the kind of ferocious speed at which consumers have been purchasing from shops on the high street, for example, it's a really dangerous circle that we're in. So I hope that answers the question.
Can I comment around that? I think it's interesting you're saying that journalists are kind of seeing them open up questions that maybe they haven't considered before. And I feel like, going back to what I was saying, it feels like a really interesting time where lots of things are shifting, that I think citizens are expecting to see that. And as you say, where things they come in at a superficial level, but they don't quite go to those interesting questions, then people are disappointed. I think there's one, journalists have a responsibility, or media have a responsibility for going into some of these bigger issues, but also there's a real want, I think, from the public. And we saw that with the David Attenborough documentary, where they actually unpicked some of this a lot more, and suddenly there was this huge surge in citizen interest. I think it was not because it wasn't there before, but because it kind of unlocked something or put something together for people to be able to understand. There was a recent fast fashion documentary on the BBC that doesn't do any of that. It just shows the surface level and doesn't go any further. And I think that's a real missed opportunity. And so many, hearing people talk about it, there was an article this week in Vital Days, I think, around how that's really disappointing, because it doesn't answer those questions or ask those questions that people are really wanting to hear.
I think we are going to break for a few minutes, and we are going to listen to our colleague Kimberly talking to us about the next sessions on the diff.
Hi, I'm Kimberly, and I'm here to tell you about 2 sessions that I'm looking forward to. On Friday at 3, why it's time to invest in the circular economy. In this session, hear how financial services company Intesa Sanpaolo has made the topic of circular economy central to their strategy. And then, for the last ever session of this year's diff, at 5 o'clock, Love Not Landfill and Where Next, how London and New York aim to make fashion circular with these 2 campaigns. Don't forget to use the hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter to comment and ask any questions during these sessions. You can catch up on anything you missed and find the full schedule at thinkdiff.co or on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's YouTube channel.
Welcome back. I would like our guests to kind of try to wrap up the 3 ideas that they would like our audience to have in mind when maybe they want to try to rewrite a new narrative for the fashion industry that would fit for a circular economy. Who would like to start? Maybe Josie?
Yeah, okay. So I think the first one, which may seem obvious, but is recognise that these are stories and that stories can be changed. And I think being aware of some of those patterns that play out that we maybe don't think about every day today is really important. And then the second thing I think is about trying to hear different perspectives on stories. So within fashion, it's quite a siloed industry and you often work particularly with your area. So try and think about how you can hear the different perspectives from people across that supply chain. And that's something we're trying to do as well with design students at the moment, working with you guys at Ellen MacArthur to run student design competitions, which are really encouraging different students to talk to one another. And we've got a workshop tomorrow that's trying to do that, because I think hearing those different perspectives is really important. And I haven't got a third one right now, so you might have to come back to me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned education, because I'm an academic, and I think one of the things we might want to look at is a new system for education around this piece. So that's both formal education and informal. So we're talking about the role of journalists and media and marketers and designers and producers. You know, how are they being educated about these things? So that's something I feel really strongly about, is looking at new models of sustainability, literacy, of circular economy, and I'm glad to say that is happening in pockets, but I think we need to consolidate that. I think for people coming in marketing, if they're tuning in and they want to know about building their brands, I think being honest about what you're doing, being honest about your challenges, and trying to be clear about what your targets are and what your strategy is, so that that helps you sort of get there, and your audience will appreciate kind of honesty and following through with things. And if I'm going to have a third, it's really, I would think, you know, fashion is circular anyway. Fashion is cyclical. I mean, what can be more cyclical than fashion? So I think just, you know, think about that.
Great. Shona?
Three are quite personal in I actually think there's a big thing around self-awareness, kind of thinking about your own person as this kind of cog in the mechanism. Like, how do you feed into the bigger conversations that we're having in a personal way? So really thinking about your purchasing and why, and do you need these things? And, you know, it's kind of that Marie Kondo, does it spark joy, which I think is complicated. Actually, I shouldn't have really brought that up. But anyway, regardless. And then engagement, like, you know, how are you engaging in fashion? From, you know, someone who thinks they don't at all, you have to clothe your body. So where is that joyfulness, and how can you find real inspiration in fashion and expressing your identity where it is really fun and it's not sort of blind consumption and sort of quick fixes? I think it's really interesting to think about what you really like and why you like it. Could it be a certain color? And I think those things really do inspire you to think more deeply about what you purchase and why. And then, yeah, I mean, the third one is probably already covered, but this kind of it being a personal journey. I love what Natasha said about education, because I think education is really key to all of this. It's about understanding the wider conversations. And I think that is a bit of a personal journey, really. You have to kind of sit back and really think about it all. Yeah.
Great. We received a question online from Freya, and she's asking, are there any outstanding examples of leaders in this space in terms of a new story already?
I think I'd say someone like Christopher Rayburn's a really interesting person to look at in terms of the concept of the business, because it is about reusing materials and remaking, and also having a stand against kind of commercialization. And also now that he's working with Timberland, a really big brand, it'd be interesting to see the initiatives they're doing. So someone like Christopher Rayburn I'd recommend.
I think there are also really interesting people who are not necessarily framing it in terms of circular economy. I'm thinking, for example, there's a company called Community Clothing in the UK, which, again, is thinking about how to bring manufacturing back on shore and making use of downtime in factories to produce capsule clothing. They're not talking necessarily about circular economy, but they're talking a lot about community and how to have good jobs and good quality items that will last. So I think, again, it's that kind of story piece which kind of connects you. Yeah, connects you to a place which maybe isn't necessarily about talking about big kind of technical systems around circularity, but is making you more mindful about how you're engaging with your clothing.
If I can add another, I'd add Nancy from Tengri. So Tengri is a really interesting business model that uses Mongolian yak fibre, and they've invented like yak schmear, and it's a really interesting business all around social justice and at the luxury level, and really, yeah, that would be well worth looking at.
I love Colleen Estrada. I went to Colleen Estrada's show at New York Fashion Week, and I nearly cried. It was so emotional, it was so beautiful. And it was styled by Charlie Engman, who's an amazing fashion photographer. And the casting was so insane, it was so beautiful. And the clothes are made from repurposed fabrics and waste, and it's just so fashionable. I think that's the thing for me, it has to be really fashionable. If it wants to really get in the kind of fleshy bit of this conversation. And then the other is Noah New York, which is Brendan Babenzine, who was creative director of Supreme for 15 years. And he set up Noah. I think it's interesting, it's the honesty around these things. Like Noah, for example, has a really interesting consumer base. It's the Supreme crowd. It's like really kind of sneaky streetwear that people kind of queue for, and it sells out super quick and stuff like that. But it's people that really, you know, the younger generation who care a lot about the environment, but they don't know where to go. And Brendan is super honest about his processes and his downfalls. Same with Colleen Estrada, same with Stella McCartney, things like that. It's like you cannot be selling things every season and sign up to a perfect model. And I think that's really interesting to me personally. So those are my really most recent kind of interesting people. They're interesting people for sure. Yeah.
We received a comment online. Grace is asking, does this mean that we should buy less and have less? That's not a very compelling story then. Who of you guys would like to react on that?
I wonder why it's not compelling.
I'm not sure that is the story necessarily. I think it's being mindful about the purchases that you make and asking, you know, Fashion Revolution have done great work asking about how things are made, you know, and understanding what you're purchasing and maybe what the real costs are. But I think certainly if we go towards things that sit slightly aside of fashion, so tailoring or something, then maybe that is something. If you're going to buy something tailor-made, maybe a Savile Row suit or something, if you're lucky enough, that is probably you are going to buy less. It's an expensive purchase. You're going to invest in something, but you're going to keep it for a long time. So I think that's a story for some people, and that might not be appropriate for everyone.
Why do we want so much, though? I don't know. It's interesting to me as a question.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like, what is it that, I'm not saying we necessarily do have to do that, but what is it that makes not having more stuff an uncompelling thing to do?
Yeah, my question.
What are the stories that tell us that if we have more, we are better? Or I think that's those kind of things are really interesting to reflect on. They're really not easy questions, but having those conversations I think are so important.
But frame might also be related to the fact that maybe if you're a maker, you want to make something. There's a human urge to create. So I can see it from that perspective. If you're a designer, maybe you want to design and you want to put things into production. So I think there are people having to ask themselves those questions. But yes, I can see maybe the question comes from that angle.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question. What a great question. It's so meaty. I mean, it's what is compelling? And I'm really thinking about it because I'm sat here and I'm looking at my wardrobe. I have so much stuff. I used to buy so many clothes. I have so many clothes. But I kind of thought lately, like, where am I going with all this stuff? Like, you know, why? Why do I have all these things? And I'm really interested in this idea of happiness, because I don't really even love that word, you know, fulfillment, contentment, and the kind of vulnerability around when you're in your most vulnerable states, I think you do really reach for more stuff. I need more stuff. I need more outfits, more ways to sort of experiment with how I want to express myself to the world. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It's really interesting. That's a great question to think about, because I think, but what we're really saying is perhaps buy less, sure, but you could also buy an awful lot of secondhand if you really were intrigued to keep purchasing. There's lots of places that you can still buy loads of stuff. You know, there's so much stuff in this world. Perhaps what we're saying more is a consideration around the new things we bring into the world. I don't know.
And we haven't really talked about rental and different models, because maybe the rental, I mean, that's the idea behind rental fashion, is that you can still have, maybe you're going through a lot of different outfits, having a lot of new things, but you're not actually owning them and keeping them. Or also new developments in digital fashion. So that's a kind of, again, a tech solution where maybe we don't have physical clothing and we're having digital fashion. So that's a whole new interesting area to look into.
I think that's really, as a designer, you're thinking about what needs people have and how you can fulfill them. And I guess it's sometimes, is the real need to have a new thing, or is it to be able to wear something new or something different once, or actually just explore and play with pattern and colour, in which case it could be a digital solution. So I think as a consumer as well, reflecting on what do you really, when you want something new, what is it that you really need from that? And could there be different ways of getting it than our traditional, our current model of just buying something new from the high street?
Well, thanks so much, all of you, for participating in this panel. We are arriving at the end of this session. I would just like to add that for the students watching us, remember that the Student Design Awards organized by the RSA this year has a brief called Make Fashion Circular. And you can send your proposal before March 2020 to share your ideas on how might we use circular design principles to innovate the way we produce, use, and access everyday clothing items. Thank you very much for watching this session. And of course, there are lots of other events coming up, so stay connected on diff.co. Thanks a lot.
We need to start making more conscious material choices.
Set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.